1944. The world is burning on every front. Europe is a continent in ruins, skies tremble beneath the roar of bombers, and millions are scattered far from the homes they once knew. But in the middle of this global chaos, thousands of miles from collapsing cities and frozen battlefields, there lies a world hidden behind barbed wire in the heart of the United States. A world that, for a group of German female prisoners of war, feels impossibly surreal. They arrive in silence, exhausted, mud-stained, half-starved from weeks of transport across countries and oceans. Their uniforms hang loose on their frames, their boots are worn, and their eyes hold the dull, quiet dread of people who have stopped expecting anything good. They brace themselves for cruelty, hunger, cold, punishment. Instead, they step into something that feels like the wrong side of reality. A long wooden hall, warm light spilling from inside, and the smell, dear God, the smell, bread, soup, fresh vegetables, coffee, even meat. The kind they haven't tasted since the war swallowed their world whole. One woman whispers, "Das ist nicht möglich." Another stares, frozen, her breath shaking. This can't be real. This can't be for them. But it is. As the American guards wave them in, the women step forward cautiously, like someone approaching a dream they expect to crumble. They had been told the enemy was brutal, merciless. They had prepared for hunger to follow them forever. Instead, on their very first afternoon in the camp, they're introduced to something they never imagined they'd find in wartime America. Lunch that looks like a feast, food with color, warmth, variety. A meal so generous that some prisoners would later recall it with disbelief for the rest of their lives. The women had been traveling for so long that time itself had begun to lose meaning. Days blurred into nights, nights into a constant, heavy fatigue that settled deep in their bones. They had been moved from one holding area to another, marched across train platforms under armed supervision, packed into transport ships with the roar of the ocean swallowing every whispered thought. Hunger followed them everywhere, silent, sharp, and merciless. By the time they reached the American mainland, their stomachs had long grown used to emptiness, to ration crumbs, to tasteless broth that barely counted as food. Most of them assumed the journey would only become harsher once they were inside enemy territory. Their first steps onto the camp grounds felt strangely unreal. The air was dry, clean, and unexpectedly warm, carrying scents they had forgotten. Pine, dust, grass that wasn't crushed beneath tank treads. For the first time in weeks, no one shouted at them to move faster. The American guards didn't glare or sneer. They simply directed the women forward, instructing them where to stand, where to form lines, where to wait. Even this simple orderliness felt unfamiliar. In Europe, war had shredded structure into chaos. Here, everything seemed unnervingly controlled. But nothing prepared them for the building that came into view as they were marched deeper into the camp. A long wooden structure with windows glowing softly from within. It didn't look imposing or threatening. It didn't look like a place where prisoners would be punished or starved. Instead, with smoke gently rising from a chimney and light spilling out in warm, golden bands, it looked like something no one dared expect. A place where food was cooked. A place where real meals were served. They slowed instinctively. Some of the women exchanged uncertain glances, the kind that carried entire conversations without a word. They had been prisoners long enough to recognize what kitchens usually meant in wartime Europe: scarcity, foul odors, and the metallic clatter of ladles scraping the bottom of nearly empty pots. They remembered mess halls back home that served watery cabbage water disguised as soup, or bread so coarse and dry it crumbled to dust in their hands. Their expectations were so low, so deeply worn into them, that the idea of anything more felt impossible. But here, the air carried something else, something rich, something warm, something that pricked memories they had tried to forget. One woman inhaled sharply, her thin shoulders trembling. Another blinked rapidly as if her eyes were playing tricks on her. Could it be real? Was the aroma drifting from the open doorway something their minds invented to survive? It smelled like potatoes, actual potatoes, and onions and bread, and something meat-like, something hearty, something they hadn't encountered in years. It unsettled them, almost frightened them, because good smells did not belong in places where captives were held. The guards continued urging them forward, but their pace dragged as the building pulled their attention. A few women slowed so much they risked being nudged or scolded, but instead of reprimands, the Americans simply repeated the same instruction: this way, calm, steady, almost indifferent, as if the women's disbelief was expected. Inside the hall, the light was warm and full, not the dim yellow of failing bulbs or kerosene lamps. The interior glowed with a brightness that felt alive. And when the first rows of prisoners finally stepped through the threshold, the scene waiting for them did not fit any version of captivity they had imagined. The mess hall was clean, not less filthy than expected, not better than a barn clean. The floors were swept, the tables arranged in long, neat rows. There were benches, actual benches, without splintered wood or missing slats. And lining the far wall, a row of steaming metal pots sat behind a serving counter, each one gleaming under electric light. The smell rising from them wrapped around the women with disarming gentleness, like a warm hand pressing lightly against their backs. Several prisoners froze in place, unable to move further. Their minds reeled. The war had conditioned them to brace for deprivation, not abundance. The hall felt like something stolen from a world before the conflict, before ration cards, before hunger, before the fear of winter nights with empty cupboards. Even the trays stacked at the front of the line looked foreign to them. Sturdy metal evenly shined. They were not the flimsy, dented tin plates they were used to. These trays had compartments, like something designed for a meal with parts, not a thin ladle of whatever broth happened to be available. The women stared at them, feeling a strange mixture of awe and suspicion. Generosity in wartime was an alien concept, especially coming from the enemy. Hadn't they been told that Americans hated them? That surrendering to the Allies meant suffering. Every story they had been fed insisted that the Western Front would crush them just as cruelly as the Eastern one. And yet, this hall, this unexpected sanctuary of warmth and structure, told a different story. One of the women, a tall figure with sunken cheeks and weary eyes, reached out and touched the edge of a tray, as if making sure it wasn't an illusion. Another tugged lightly at the sleeve of the woman beside her, whispering that something wasn't right. This was too organized, too peaceful, too human. Her whisper went unanswered, because by now, the first few women at the front of the line had stepped close enough to see what waited inside the pots. A cook, an older American man with rolled-up sleeves, lifted a lid and steam billowed upward into the hall. The sight of hearty vegetables simmering in broth, or meat chunks floating in a thick, fragrant stew, hit them harder than any weapon could have. The prisoners leaned forward instinctively. Eyes widened, breaths hitched. A wave of murmurs rippled across the room, quiet, shaky, disbelieving. It wasn't just food, it was comfort. Color, warmth, everything they had been deprived of since the war began. Some women swallowed hard, feeling their throats tighten. It was almost painful to look at. Hunger did strange things to the mind, sometimes making a person suspicious, sometimes emotional, sometimes detached. But here, in this clean, glowing hall, each woman felt something unfamiliar stirring inside her. Hope? No, not yet. But something close, something softer than fear. They had brought their suffering with them. Their losses, their guilt, their exhaustion. They expected hostility from their captors, not hospitality from their kitchens. Yet the Americans working behind the counter gave them the same indifferent efficiency they might show in a school cafeteria or a factory break room. They served food the way people do when they're simply doing their job. Not making a point, not delivering a punishment, not sending a message, just serving. And that normalcy, that simple, unremarkable normalcy, was the most astonishing thing of all. As more women entered, the shock deepened. They touched the backs of chairs, traced fingertips along tabletops, studied the neat layout of utensils, plates, cups. Everything looked intentional, consistent, prepared, not thrown together as an afterthought. Even the lighting seemed to shine on them with a kind of indifferent warmth. For the first time since their capture, many of the women felt the full weight of their assumptions cracking. They had imagined harsh American camps, cruel rations, harsh punishments. Instead, they were confronted with an environment that contradicted everything they had prepared their minds for. This was a place designed for order, for functionality, for feeding people, not starving them. Their hunger, which had been a dull, constant ache, suddenly roared to life again, fueled by the scent of real food waiting just steps away. The sight of it, the abundance, the structure, the brightness, sent a tremor through them that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with disbelief. Some felt tears sting their eyes. Others felt shame or confusion or quiet gratitude they didn't know how to express. And some simply stared, unable to reconcile that in a world drowning in destruction, a place like this still existed. They had expected captivity. They had not expected mercy. And standing there, in the warm light of the American mess hall, they realized their understanding of the war and of their enemy was already beginning to change. The line moved slowly, so slowly that the women had time to study every inch of the mess hall, every flicker of light on the metal serving pots, every unfamiliar smell drifting through the warm air. Their bodies were exhausted, lightheaded, trembling with cold and hunger, but the shock of what they saw before them kept their senses painfully sharpened. Even the shallow rise and fall of their breath felt foreign, as if their lungs were relearning what hope tasted like. As the first group stepped forward, the cooks behind the counter began readying the ladles. They did it without ceremony, without speaking loudly or rushing, like men accustomed to feeding hundreds of people every day. There was no harshness in their movements, no disdain in their eyes. They were not soldiers intimidating captives. They were workers, practical, steady, unbothered by the fact that the women approaching them were technically the enemy. At that moment, the cooks were simply doing their job, and that subtle normalcy rattled the prisoners even more than the scent of the food itself. One of the German women reached the front of the line. Her tray trembled in her hands, the metal clinking softly as she struggled to control the shaking in her fingers. The American cook in front of her didn't flinch or hesitate. He dipped his ladle deeply into a pot and poured out a thick serving of stew, actual stew, into the main compartment of her tray. Chunks of meat slid across the surface, accompanied by potatoes and carrots that still held their shape, softened but not dissolved. The smell of herbs rose into the air, gently hitting her in the face like a memory of her pre-war kitchen. She froze. Her eyes darted up toward the cook's face, then back down at the food. For a moment, she didn't breathe. Her mind refused to register what she was looking at. The last time she had seen pieces of meat that size, the world had still been whole. The war had not yet bled all color from daily life. Bread wasn't rationed. Vegetables weren't scraped together from scraps. This felt like a dream from a lifetime ago. Behind her, the women watched with a mix of hunger and disbelief. The stew filling the air with warmth felt like an intrusion into the stark reality they knew. It should not have been possible. Not here. Not now, and certainly not for them. Another prisoner stepped forward. She was younger, barely old enough to be considered a woman, and her thin frame made the tray look heavier than it was. The cook gave her the same portion, no more and no less. He did not look at her with pity or suspicion or anger. To him, she was simply another person in line. That small, almost invisible act of equality struck her harder than she expected. She blinked rapidly, trying to keep her expression steady. The line inched forward. More trays were filled. With each serving, the women's disbelief deepened. Fresh bread appeared next, loaves sliced into generous portions, the golden crust still warm. When the cook handed the first slice to one of the prisoners, she stared at it as though it were a relic, fragile and precious. Bread in wartime Europe had become an object of desperation. It was stretched with fillers and darkened with barley husk or sawdust, baked in portions too small to satisfy and too rough to enjoy. To hold a slice of American bread, soft, light, fragrant, felt like holding something sacred. Another cook added vegetables to their trays, peas, beans, and carrots that were whole, not thin shavings hunted from the bottom of a pot. The colors alone were enough to make several of the women gasp. Green, orange, yellow. Colors they had long forgotten existed on a dinner plate. Then came the fruit, apples, real apples, polished to a shine. One prisoner touched hers as if expecting it to crumble into dust. She lifted it slowly, turning it in her hand, mesmerized by its weight and firmness. She had not seen a fresh apple since the early years of the war. She had almost forgotten the sound of biting into one. The crisp snap, the burst of sweetness, the simple human pleasure of it. When the line reached the back of the hall, the women were directed toward the long wooden tables arranged in neat rows. The benches were smooth, sturdy, free of dirt or splinters. They sat cautiously, unsure if they were allowed to eat yet. Some watched the guards, waiting for an order. Others kept their heads lowered, instinctively bracing for correction. But the guards remained silent, leaning against the walls with casual posture, not hostility. Slowly, hesitantly, the women brought their trays closer. Silence swallowed the hall, not the harsh silence of fear, but the fragile, breathless quiet that comes when people encounter something overwhelming. The first woman to take a bite did so with trembling hands. Her spoon dipped into the stew. She lifted it to her lips. Her mouth opened, and when the flavor hit her tongue, her eyes fluttered shut. It wasn't just the taste. It was the memory it unlocked. A memory of home, of her mother cooking in a warm kitchen, of laughter drifting from another room, of simpler days before the world shattered. The next woman took a bite, then another, then another. Soon the hall filled with the gentle clinking of spoons against metal trays, a sound that felt almost musical after months of starvation. But it wasn't joy that filled the room. It wasn't relief. It was something deeper and heavier. Grief. Grief for the years of deprivation. Grief for the families left behind. Grief for the way war had stripped them of basic humanity. And grief for the simple truth that the enemy was feeding them better than their own collapsing nation had been able to. Some of the women ate slowly, savoring each bite as if afraid the food might disappear. Others ate quickly, the instinct of starvation still ruling their movements. A few paused after every mouthful, tears gathering in their eyes. The warmth of the stew felt unfamiliar on their tongues, their throats, their stomachs. It hurt in a way they couldn't describe. A woman near the center of the hall stopped eating altogether. She placed her spoon down and covered her mouth with her hand. Her eyes filled with tears so quickly she couldn't blink them away. The woman next to her gently placed a hand on her arm, offering silent comfort. No words could capture the feeling of sitting before a meal that seemed too generous to belong in a wartime prison. Others struggled to process the moment. They had been told Americans despised them. They had been trained to expect cruelty. Instead, they were treated as human beings, fed with care, served without mockery, given portions that reflected dignity, not punishment. And that realization shook them more than hunger ever had. Even as they ate, many looked around the hall in quiet, dazed awe. The structure, the warm lighting, the murmured voices, the organized flow of the line, everything felt like a world apart from the chaos they had come from. It was as though the war existed outside the hall, but had not managed to breach its walls. This meal did not end their captivity. It did not erase their losses, but it awakened something in them that had long been dormant, the knowledge that not every hand reaching toward them carried harm, the possibility that survival could come with dignity, the fragile truth that even in war, humanity could appear in unexpected places. When the women finally finished eating, the hall remained quiet, not because they were afraid, but because they were overwhelmed. That lunch, simple by American standards, felt extraordinary to them. It was a moment they would later return to over and over, replaying it in their minds, anchoring it to their memories of wartime captivity. For now, though they sat in silence, absorbing the warmth inside their bodies, feeling life returning to places inside them that had been cold for years, it was not just a meal. It was a reminder, a contradiction, a shock to the soul, and for many of them, it was the first step into understanding that the enemy they had been taught to fear did not always match the reality they found on the other side of the ocean. In the years that followed the war, long after the guns went silent and the skies stopped trembling with the roar of bombers, the memories that clung to the former prisoners were not always the ones people expected. Most assumed that these women, like all POWs, would remember the barbed wire, the watchtowers, the uniformed guards pacing their routes with rifles against their shoulders. And they did. But threaded between those harsher memories was one that felt strangely gentle, one that softened the edges of their recollections. The day they were served their first American meal. To outsiders it might have seemed trivial. Just lunch. Just another day in a POW camp. But for these women, that first meal had carved itself into their minds with an intensity that time could not erase. It was not simply about the food itself. Though the abundance, the warmth, the fragrance had stunned them into silence. It was about what the moment represented, the shattering of an expectation so deeply rooted that it took only a plate of simple wartime stew to unravel it. Before their capture, they had been told the enemy had no mercy, that surrender was weakness, that the Western world, especially the Americans, would relish the chance to humiliate them. They had been prepared for cruelty. They were hollow shadows, driven by orders, emptied by rationing, burdened by fears they couldn't express. But when they sat down at those long wooden tables, surrounded by the clinking of spoons against metal trays, they felt something return to them, the sensation of being alive, not just surviving the war. The food warmed more than their stomachs. It warmed memories long buried beneath the frost of wartime deprivation. One former prisoner, decades later, described the experience with tears in her eyes. She said the warmth of that meal felt like an echo of her mother's kitchen, a faint reminder of childhood winters before the world fractured. She said it was the first time during the war that she allowed herself to think about the future rather than just the next day. She said it made her realize she was still a person, not simply a soldier, not simply a prisoner, not simply a number. Another recalled how she could not bring herself to eat the apple placed on her tray. She hid it away, saving it for days, sometimes taking it out just to hold it, to reassure herself that it was real. She said the apple was the first possession she felt belonged to her after the war had taken everything else. It became a symbol of safety, of control, of hope. She couldn't eat it until it began to turn soft, and when she finally took the first bite, it tasted like relief. Their memories varied in detail, but the emotion behind them remained the same. They carried that moment through their lives, tucked into the corners of their minds like a small flame that refused to extinguish. They remembered the warmth of the hall on a cold day. They remembered the sight of steam rising from the pots, They remembered the soft murmur of foreign voices and the stunned silence of their own group. They remembered the weight of the tray in their hands, the smell of real food, the sensation of sitting down at a table without dread. And strangely, even after they returned home, after they rebuilt their lives, married, raised children, grew old, they often contrasted that American meal with the hardships they faced in the collapsing years of their homeland. The memory served as a reminder that humanity could resurface even in the darkest times, even between enemies, even in captivity. In every retelling, their voices softened when they reached the part where they took their first bite. That moment lived inside them, not because it erased the horrors of war, but because it briefly interrupted them. It showed them that compassion could appear in unexpected forms, that not all enemy hands had armored themselves with fear. They had silently rehearsed endurance, convinced they would be starved, mistreated, perhaps even killed, and then, unexpectedly, impossibly, they were handed a meal that felt like something out of the world that the war had taken from them. Years later, as old women with tired eyes and weathered hands, they spoke about it to grandchildren who could not imagine a world where eating was not guaranteed. The story would always begin the same way, with disbelief. They described the hall of warm light, the smell of bread and meat, the way the steam rising from the pots had wrapped around them like a forgotten memory. How they had hesitated, physically unable to believe the food was meant for them. And always, without fail, they remembered the silence that fell when they took the first bite. But the memory was not cherished simply because the food tasted good. Time and again, they insisted it was something deeper, something harder to articulate. That meal had confronted them with the uncomfortable truth that the world was more complicated than the propaganda they had been fed. The enemy, the faceless figure painted by wartime rhetoric, suddenly became human, not a monster, not a shadow, just ordinary people who fed their prisoners adequately and without cruelty. Some of the women admitted, with a softness in their voice, that the moment felt like the first time they realized they might survive the war after all. Not merely exist, but survive with dignity, with warmth, with the faint possibility of rebuilding their lives. The guards who served them that food were not offering friendship. They were not absolving guilt or rewriting the brutal realities of the conflict. They were simply acknowledging, perhaps unintentionally, that even in war, there were lines that civilization refused to cross, and so the meal became a symbol, a turning point. A moment when the women realized their captors did not intend to strip them of humanity. It was a foundation on which later experiences would build. American medical care, structured work assignments, educational programs, even laughter shared at unexpected moments. But the meal came first, and it was the shock of that unexpected kindness that made every step afterward easier to accept. The weight of that memory grew heavier with time, not lighter. Some of the women confessed that it haunted them, because the kindness of the enemy forced them to confront the complexities of their own side. The war had taken so much from them, and in that moment the mercy shown by their captors stirred conflicting emotions: gratitude, confusion, guilt, and the aching reminder that they had been fighting for a world collapsing from within. Many of the women later described how the meal changed the way they saw themselves. When they entered the camp with violence, that sometimes survival arrived in the shape of a warm bowl of stew and a slice of golden bread. Even as the decades passed and many of these women faded into history, the story lived on through those who listened. Their children and grandchildren repeated it not as a tale of war, but as a lesson about humanity. Listeners understood that what the women remembered was not a menu, but a moment. The moment they realized the world was larger than the hatred that had consumed it. And in that moment, sitting in a warm hall halfway across the world from the ruins of their homes, They understood that the war would end someday, and they would walk away with memories shaped not just by suffering, but by unexpected mercy. It was a lunch that became a memory that became a lesson that became a story, and a story that survived long after the women who first lived it